Hi, Terry Bolt here. This is our lecture for Chapter 2 of the TWWIST Tactical Writing with Impactful Storytelling Techniques book. This chapter is called Loops. We're going to be talking about looping through, looking at your objectives, your opportunities, and some preliminary stories. So, quote for the chapter, don't wait for the right opportunity, create it. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. How are we going to help create that opportunity? But it's going to turn out for lots of our things. We're going to have to come back and figure out a balance between creating it and finding a way to help somebody else get their objectives done. So this is the sort of core of where we're aiming with our target. We have to aim for the objectives and opportunities of what we're going to go through. This chapter will cover that material. So sort of the overview we're going to be looking at, we're going to look at discovering and setting your objectives. So we're going to talk about some of the importance of setting them. Look at the particular technique called SMART for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, and objectives. Distinguish a little bit between vague goals and SMART objectives. Look a little bit about individual self-assessment and personal goals, talking about SWAT analysis for both you and for an organization. Talk about team objective setting, some relationship between short-term objectives, long-term objectives, and the tactical objective refinement process. And then we'll get into opportunities and searching for opportunities. So at the core of tactical writing is the objectives. And so I recommend in our process that we look at what we call SMART objectives. They have 5 characteristics. The first is that they're specific. And what do we mean by specific? Well, a not specific example would be we want our organization to increase engagement. Yeah, it's engagement and you want to increase it, but that's not really very specific, right? Better would be we aim to increase reader engagement with our security briefs, because engagement doesn't say what kind of engagement with what things your company might provide. Measurable, as an example, would be something where we can measure it. If we can't measure it, it's really hard to tell that we're actually making any progress. So a non-measurable objective would be we need to foster better understanding among stakeholders. A classic example, you'll see this kind of line all the time. But a measurable one would be we aim to increase click-through rate on our links in our policy updates by 15%. So that's a measurable goal. I want you to stop and think for a second, coming back to that, stakeholders, how might you make that into a measurable example? So one way would be to actually think about how I can measure understanding among our stakeholders. So one way to do that would be actually have surveys where you ask them how they think they understand. If you're really trying to get to understanding, you might actually have some way of measuring actual understanding by looking at reports that show knowledge. So like in education, we give exams or quizzes, right? With your stakeholders, that can be tricky, but you could ask for them to provide notes, and then you could analyze those notes to understand what the understanding is. Better understanding among your stakeholders could actually be a very important objective, but if it's just foster it, you're not measuring it. So you got to find some way to think about how to measure those kinds of things. The A in SMART, the third characteristic, is achievable. So something that's not achievable practically, we want to reach every single employee with our updates. Your chance of getting 100% compliance for anything or 100% opening of an email, pretty much zero. Achievable, we aim to increase our email open rates for our company-wide announcements by 30%. So that's just looking for an improvement. You do 30% often enough, you do 30% every month, you're going to get closer and closer to 100%, but reaching every single employee is not very realistic. And if it's not achievable, then you might want to think about how you're going to make it into an achievable one. The R in SMART, the fourth characteristic, is relevant. So something that might not be relevant, we want to rank higher on Google search. That could actually be very important if you're talking about a company and you want your products there. But if you're talking about an internal communication team where it's something you're doing inside, or say a proposal, neither of those would be relevant for ranking high on Google search. But if you're talking about for an internal communication team, a relevant version might be we want to ensure that 90% of the staff reads and understands news updates. Again, you have a little bit of a tricky thing there in terms of you got 90%, that's great. You can easily measure opening. The understanding in that relevant gets to be a little tricky, so you'd have to push that a little farther. And then the last one is T, time-bounded. So if we have an objective that says we want to make our updates more appealing, but we don't say when, then we have no way to know when we need to take the measurement to decide if we actually achieve that relevant and specific goal. So we want it to be time-bounded. And the example here, right, we will increase the usage of visual aids in our monthly updates over the next quarter. So over the next quarter means that's the time we're going to want to go ahead and do those measurements. These are pretty simple. Again, it's not hard to remember. You want SMART objectives, and then think about how to make them formalized as you go through this process. Now, I've bounced across here multiple different examples, but one of the things you also want to keep in mind is that you're not going to have an objective in general. You're going to have multiple objectives for you as a person, maybe multiple objectives for the organization for sure. So you might actually want to go through them, and as you're going through this process, try and see which ones are SMART and which ones are not. But a word of caution, don't just go for the ones that are measurable and maybe achievable, the low-hanging fruit. Think about what you really want out of the objectives and take the time to figure out how to make them measurable and achievable. If it's measured, you're going to be able to measure your progress, but you don't want to stick to those things which are just trivial to measure or easy to measure, because those might not be the most important objectives. So from your own personal self-assessment, one of the things we're going to want to do in this class is your own assessment. And this is a thing that can often get lost when you're in an organization, so I wanted to bring this up and recommend you actually make sure you do this, even if it's not done on company time when you're working on a project where you're going to be doing some tactical writing. You want to know what you want to do. So what are your ambitions? And what kinds of tasks can you be involved in that will align with your long-term career goals? You're going to want to do a personal SWOT analysis, identifying your job-related strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we'll talk about that in just a minute to make sure everyone's seen it. Most people have seen it in high school, but we'll cover it just to be sure. And then, given you've done that and you know where your ambitions are, you might have to add some refinements to your processes to upskill in places where you need it and be able to leverage your strength for advancement. So if you're trying to advance in some dimension of the company, you could be heading more towards management and leadership. You could be wanting to get more technical. Don't know what that is. That's your objective. But you got to figure out what those things are going to be and keep working on those. And then when you're working on a tactical writing effort, you're going to try and find some way to use that. So part of that is a feedback loop where you seek feedback from your peers and your supervisor. When you're working on a team project, you can ask them to give you honest feedback. That's the only way you really know how what you're doing and saying lands on other people, which is what matters. You may think you're doing a great technical job and other people think you're way down in the weeds and you're missing the big picture. You got to figure out what that is. I strongly recommend you do this by keeping a journal where you keep written records of your objectives, your feedback, and then your changes over time. So you can have your own objective of improving your understanding of how you're doing, and then you can make that measurable and have time bounded in other aspects of SMART. So you can say, okay, over the next 3 months, I want to get feedback 4 times. Use that as a way of trying to improve your performance at work with respect to your writing or whatever else is going on. As you go through this, you can use that journal for insights for your growth and job opportunities so that you can figure out how you want to grow as a career. Then you might map that with a career chart where you sort of make a path of what you're going to do, what milestones you need to hit, what it's going to take to do them, and then adjust your goals based on what achievements and what your feedback is showing you so that you might have to make intermediate goals to get where you want to be. View tactical writing, but view the rest of your career. You're really looking at professional development for better prospects. You're always going to be continually learning and realigning objectives. Periodically assess where you are, adapt your goals, and figure out where you want to be. And it's actually nice to have this as something you do on a regular basis. I've seen way too many employees in my own companies who were sort of coasting along, not really thinking about where they wanted to be. And then at our annual review, I'd ask them, how they thought the year went and where they thought they wanted to be. And they're like, yeah, I didn't really achieve what I wanted to. I said, well, let's talk about why. And very often it's because they didn't actually set feedback loop timing mechanisms. So you want to improve, use this analysis as part of that. So for both the company and for yourself, you want to think about analysis. And one useful tool that many organizations do, so you need to know the terms here, is a SWOT analysis, standing for strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And so these are actually broken down in the horizontal on this slide. The sort of darker column are things that are internal, things inside of the internal origin. So the people or the organization. So if you're doing a personal SWOT analysis, this is about you. If it's an organization, then this is about what are the strengths and weaknesses of the organization itself. And then the strengths are clearly those things that are helpful to achieve some objective, and harmful are things that really don't help achieving the objective. This is the kind of thing when you're doing your own self-assessment, people often miss or they're not willing to face their weaknesses. And some organizations, depending on how the management works, will also want to focus mostly on their strengths and miss the weaknesses. When you're looking at tactical writing, you got to remember that eventually your writing is going to be read by somebody outside your organization or somebody above you in your organization, but whoever's analyzing it will be able to see weaknesses that you might be trying to avoid or showing or hiding. So make sure you understand them, so you understand both how to do better and make them better, but also how to present them. Sometimes what might look like a weakness on its face value can be turned into a potential strength by viewing it as this is what gives you some unique characteristic. So, as you saw, right, I have a weakness. I am dyslexic. But in the end, I think that weakness was something I was able to turn around into strength. It turns out that dyslexics are significantly overrepresented among entrepreneurs. And one of the reasons hypothesized and various studies have shown is that because dyslexics had this weakness early on, they learn how to compensate by working with other people that makes them better at dealing with getting help. So that weakness became a strength for me, and that's why I call it a differential ability. I'm good at some things, weaker at others. That depends on how you want to present it. So the other part of the SWOT analysis is the bottom row. This is the opportunities and threats. These are things that are external to the organization. They're basically things in the environment. So a personal opportunity is something that might be helpful, might build on your strength, but it has to live outside of you. Your opportunity to do better, well, that's a personal strength. That's an internal kind of thing. Well, you might use the word opportunity in the SWOT analysis. Opportunities are those things that are external, and threats are also things that are external. So this would be things like competition. It could be, the lack of resources, which can be tricky because if I can't hire somebody because the job market is or the candidate pool for the job market is so tight, then it's a threat. If I can't hire somebody because I don't have the internal money, then that's a weakness, right? So you got to figure out where these are going to be. It's not super critical that you characterize everything exactly correctly into the SWOT elements. But the point of this is when you're doing your analysis is stop and think, what are the threats? What are the opportunities? What are the weaknesses? What are the strengths? And work through a list of what those things can be. When you're looking at the environment and you're looking externally, it's sometimes even useful to break it down into pieces in terms of sort of competition of companies, regulatory environment issues, social issues, right? In terms of customers, right? Their customers are also external to your environment. Looking at any one of those might give you different views of opportunities and threats. So the next thing I want to bring up is the issues of working in a team objective setting. So SWOT analysis, again, commonly used within your teams. And this can be something where you really run into some issues if you haven't worked at trying to set team objectives. Some advantages of working in a team for setting objectives are you generally get diverse insights. Multiple people will bring different perspectives that can foster both innovative solutions and a better view of potential threats. Very often when one person in the team doesn't see a threat, somebody else might see it. And that's why doing a SWOT analysis in a team can be so effective, both in terms of the opportunities and strengths and the weaknesses and threats. If you do a team objective setting and you all agree on the objectives, you get shared accountability. The team shares the success, you've collectively learned from the failures, and you are all accountable, which sometimes means you're going to make sure you jump in and work together to solve it. This is distinct compared to when sometimes people view a team as we're going to divide up things and each person has a responsibility. If that happens because a manager just assigns people work, then there isn't this shared accountability. The manager is accountable for getting everything done, and each person is just working on their piece, and they don't necessarily have the same level of working together. And then finally, team objective setting can lead to enhanced synergy. Again, building on the insights, but also because the combined skills can lead to superior outcomes where the different people working together will brainstorm and build off of each other. So it's not even that you started with diverse things. If you've gone through good brainstorming techniques, which you should have in your 1010 class, right? You recognize that you first start with a bunch of independent ideas, but then as you share them, they evolve, and that synergy can make things to much better approaches. But there can also be some real challenges to working in team for objective setting. The first is that you can get misaligned goals. Differing objectives can really pull a team apart. If somebody says this is the critical thing and somebody else is saying, no, that's not important at all, you get some personal interactions that become negative, and it can really hurt the team dynamic. It's important to address that by making sure that you go in with an open mind, and remember, you can have your own personal objectives, and you want to relate them to the team. The team is really talking about what's best for the organization that you're trying to work with. Another very important one is communication barriers, where misunderstandings can hinder progress and actually can be part of what makes the team get pulled apart farther, because the misunderstandings can lead to resentment when you think somebody is saying something that is, for example, dissing you in some way and putting you down, and really they meant something slightly different. This becomes especially difficult when you're dealing with multicultural issues, where what you might think of as a reasonable statement might be very insulting to somebody from Japan or somebody from another culture, and they can do the same to you. So you have to understand those communication elements, again, work through them. And then related to the communication barrier is the issue of unequal participation. Some people can be either intending to or just roped into doing a whole lot more work, and being dominant or passive in a sort of personal interaction level can skew a lot of the results and make things unequal in the team, and that can lead to resentment that causes communication barriers. But sometimes that unequal participation is because of a communication barrier where the people who are more quiet and reserved, more introverted, tend not to share all the things they're doing because they don't like to talk about stuff as much. And then other team members can miss it. So as you go through things in this class, you're working a team, I'm going to be asking you to be documenting all kinds of stuff anyhow, but you want to make sure you're sharing among your team members what's being accomplished. You don't have to brag. It's not being boastful. It's like, I accomplished these this week. Here's my goals for next week. That's a great way of making sure you're dealing with the participation. Nothing says participation has to be equal. In fact, in many organizations, participation for tactical writing is nowhere near equal. There's 2 or 3 people that are doing a large amount of the work, and then 15 or 20 people that are there for different roles. You have to have your participation balance what your role is. There's some unique techniques to help adjust these. So with respect to getting the objectives all put together, having a unified vision workshop where you share understanding and align goals. This is actually at a company level done frequently, even not for a particular project, but as a general overall company set of goals and alignments. And then when you get to a particular writing project, there's often a kickoff meeting where people will get together and they will agree, this is what our objectives are. Before you do any of the opportunity finding, or it might be the opportunity is already identified, but either way, before you get too far down the tactical writing process, you're going to want to have that kind of meeting across most of the team. You want to have open communication protocols, things that foster transparency and clarity. You got to remember people have different communication styles. Some of your team members might prefer emails. Lots of organizations will have some standard communication that they tell you is what they want. So you want to be able to keep them together. And then as part of the Unified Vision Workshop, but even if not done there, you want to do separately, you want to make sure you have a role clarification session. You want to make sure everyone contributes meaningfully, and importantly, everyone knows what everyone else's roles are. There's actually a technique called RAM where you want to have role assignment matrix where you have a formal document that says who's doing what. It's briefly mentioned in the chapter. I'll actually cover it later when we get to more effective team working, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But when you get started, you want to say, here's our roles, here's who's doing what, and that helps you really put all this together. Now, one of the things that's another difficulty in the team objective and shows up frequently is connecting short-term objectives with a long-term vision. Companies often have a much clearer long-term vision. It's actually often very vague. It's not a SMART objective for many of them. But the short-term objectives, you want to be smart. But we have to think about how we put them together. So short-term objectives are really, they're short-term by definition. We want to prioritize tasks for now and we want to use them to set a pace. Often we will have a sequence of short-term objectives. We'll break a larger project into multiple pieces. And for those of you who do software, you can think of these as sprints in doing your software development. But in any large project, tactical writing project, there's a sequence of things that get happening. And achievement of hitting some of those early steps become a morale booster and they propel more action. So you want to think of defining these short-term objectives, not just the end goal, but steps along the way so that as people are working towards them, they feel they're making progress and everyone gets to see this. It can actually be useful when you're doing those short-term achievements to make sure that almost every role has something that gets hit by some of those milestones so that some people don't feel left out. Unless, of course, you've intentionally made the role so something shows up later, in which case they're fine. And you want to think about this sort of foundational layers where each short-term goal is a brick in the longer-term vision. And as you're working towards that vision, you know how the bricks are going to happen. It is not uncommon in project management for this to be literally structured as a chart or a Gantt chart where there's little blocks of time and there's clear interactions of how they feed together. It's not always, in fact, often is not a linear progression. There might be 3 or 4 short-term things all happening in parallel that then feed together into the next thing. For example, you might have 1 or 2 people working on some of the research elements where other people are working on some of the sort of boilerplate that goes in a proposal, and yet a third group is working on some of the figures and graphics. All 3 of them then have a milestone where they come together and they have a meeting and put some of those pieces together. So you want to think of them, but don't think of them in purely linear fashion. And when we're dealing with the goals from short-term to long-term, you want to make sure you sort of identify overlaps and conflicting goals. So where the short-term tasks intersect with each other or where they intersect with long-term goals, you want to sometimes you want to make sure you're minimizing the duplication, but other times you actually want 2 pretty much in parallel teams doing similar things because you're not sure which idea will work out better and you want to evaluate later. You just need to be clear about that. You don't want 2 teams thinking they're competing when really the goal is we might use both of them, right? It's not like there's a down select half and half. Work through that. Assess the impact, which short-term goals can significantly shape the future, and if they conflict, which has greater risk. Very often, it's a natural tendency for some personality types to take the risk and push it off as far as possible. Let's do the simple, easy things we know how to do and deal with the hard things later. Other people are going to want to jump in and deal with the risky things first. In most projects, it is better to maximize your reduction of risk early. So you want to take the things that are risky that you can work on and try and resolve those early. But you have to have the team agree on that. And again, that's where some personality conflicts can come up. And then we want to have techniques to formalize, communicate, and prioritize everything we're doing with the short term and the mapping to long term. The formalization of communication is important in larger organizations, especially because some of the people above you will not necessarily be at all these meetings, and the communication is part of what goes up to them so they can say, okay, I get it, I understand what's going on. So your boss might be there, but your boss's boss might not. So you want to make it so that your boss's job of communicating what we're going to do in these objectives gets communicated up the stream appropriately. If you can connect those to their long-term aspirations, then the upper management can understand why we're doing this. It actually helps your team members understand why, but they might have been in the meeting. Writing it down, formalizing this can make that helpful. You want to also come up with some timelines where you actually have sessions, where you have regular check-ins to assure people are aligned, tackle any deviations from your project plan early. Again, this is standard project management. This will come back up later in class as well. And maybe some priority setting sessions where you address conflicts and assure team alignment. We already talked about having one of those in the beginning, but as your process continues to move along, you might need to reassess those priorities. So your regular check-ins would include some potential for reassessing priorities. So that's talking about objectives. Now we're going to move forward to talking a little bit about opportunities. And we're going to do this in a way that I'm going to talk with first, what are some of the classic types of opportunities? And the book talks about a number of things that are less formal, but I'm going to start with the things that are a little bit more formal. So there's a whole bunch of terms, again, there's a table in the book, where people talk about how various organizations formally tell the world they're interested in people submitting solutions, which is basically them saying, here's an opportunity. If you can do what we're asking for, then please let us know so that we can consider you for this opportunity. So The two most common that you'll see in the U.S. are call for proposals and request for proposals, RFP and CFP. And they're pretty much synonymous. It really comes down to what the agency is going to do in terms of which one is being done. I would say if there's any real difference, it's that requests for proposals tend to be a little bit more one-off, and call for proposals tend to be these ongoing, reoccurring things. In both of these, they're going to have very industry-specific or organization-specific statements about what they're trying to do. They can be extremely broad and large with a $100 million opportunity, or they could be $500. Right? There's nothing here that says anything about what their scopes are. In some other parts of the world, in the UK and some of the Commonwealth countries, in India, things that were under the UK, they will sometimes use the term invitation to tender, ITT. And this tends to be a little bit more narrow. Often it's about buying something particular. Requests for proposals could be something to buy a particular piece of equipment, or they could be broader. Invitations to tender tend to be more very specified goods and services. Even more specified would be things in the U.S. where we would use the term request for quotation, where they might know exactly what they want. I'm looking for 4,000 cubic meters of cement to be delivered on this date, and I want vendors to bid on providing it. This is a way where companies that have a long-standing process, instead of them going out and calling 15 vendors to get price quotes, they put out an official request for a quotation asking for people to send them their price quotes, and that gives them a way of doing it. A number of these, especially these first four, are techniques that are often required by government agencies for the way different groups will work, so that they can understand we've got multiple quotations. Everything was fair. You can't just be letting a contract just to somebody because they're your friend. You don't just get 3 quotations. You put it out there. You go through a formal bidding process. A very different approach, or actually it's a precursor for some of the above. When the agencies or organizations aren't sure if they can even get what they want, they will sometimes do what's called a request for information, or RFI. It's often a preliminary step to one of the above. And the real idea here is to gather information about capabilities of various suppliers and what's out there. These tend to be much more used for much more advanced projects. If I'm buying something that's as mundane as cement, I don't need an RFI. But if I'm asking whether or not somebody could build solar panels that are flexible enough to be attached to the roof of a car and strong enough to withstand hail, I might not know the answers to that question. So I have to have a request for information to give companies a chance to sort of say, I don't want to specify exactly what I want because I don't know what's available. So this is an opportunity often to go in and influence what will happen. And I've taken part on my side in multiple requests for information. There's another term for it. Sometimes they're called industry briefing days, where the agency will tell you as part of the request for information, they're going to brief you to the industry. Here's what we're looking for. And then the follow-up to that is a request for information. Being involved in these gives you often advanced knowledge. And when you're talking about something, it might be a 150-page proposal. To get 2 extra months to know generally where something's going gives you a head start. But maybe more importantly, your ability to influence where it's going to go and what it's going to be might give you a significant advantage over your competition, because if the competition drives it one way, it may not be well suited to your company's solutions. If they drive another way, you might towards you have a better advantage. On the academic side, there's often something we call CFP, call for papers, with the same acronym as call for proposals, and that just makes it confusing. But this is a place, so you have to be careful searching for CFP. If they're looking for papers, that's an opportunity if you're trying to publish, not an opportunity if you're looking for money. Expressions of interest are a little bit like a request for information, but in this case, it's more about understanding how big the market can be, how many people could provide. Expressions of interest sometimes show up for things where they know exactly what they want, but they're not sure how many people will be bidding, and they have to set up the mechanisms, the review process, and whatever to figure out what's going to be happening. Another thing that will happen sometimes with expression of interest is they will use this as a weak form of a call for proposals. Think of it as a call for pre-proposals. in the expression of interest. They'll have a formal process where you might turn in a 2-page letter of intent, which is your expression of interest. And then they might evaluate that and give you feedback so that they save you time because you're not likely to win a proposal, and save them time because they don't have to review everything. So it's a way of working through this. And call for bids is used similarly, but it's used mostly in construction and real estate industries where they have something very particular for a project. So it's a little bit like a request for quotation, but they're looking for bids, and they, compared to a quotation, a request for call for bids will allow you to have a lot more flexibility in what your answer is because they know what they want to achieve. I want a building that can, house 300 students, whatever. But exactly what the design is something they're not specifying. So that's why it gets used in those kinds of industries. Again, not in the U.S. There's in Australia, New Zealand, there's requests for applications, which is associated with some of their granting agencies. And they really use this as a way of sort of announcing that we're going to have particular opportunities, and then they send you down paths to what's going on. Notice inviting tender is a lot like the invitation to tender. And again, this is actually more about, instead of just the invitation, it's often a notice that there's going to be one, and then there is a formal invitation as either part of it or a separate offering that comes out later. And requests for offers fall in the same similar category. They're pretty much just pure business things. Probably should have this differently, but the request for expression of interest used by some agencies in Australia and New Zealand is really, again, coming back to this idea of shortlisting. So this is like you're going to turn this in, and then they're going to give you feedback so that you can decide whether or not it's worth your time, and they can decide whether or not it's worth their time for you to move forward in this process. So there's a bunch of terms, but as you notice, there's really 2 or 3 things that are pretty common. There's either a call or a request or an expression, and then it's either for a proposal, a quotation, interest, bids, right? They're synonymous terms. So almost all of these is some organization expressing to you, we have an opportunity, and we're making this opportunity available to everybody, and often by law they have to, so there's a level playing field, and they're going to go through that. We'll go through some examples very briefly to talk about this, but I want to relate this back to what we've been talking about. We were talking about your objectives as a person or your objectives as a company, and you'll notice that these aren't really necessarily, these opportunities aren't aligned with those, right? These are aligned with the organization that's putting out the call for proposals or the request for bids, right? Those people have their objectives, and this is a mechanism for them to tell you what their objectives are for this particular project, and then you're going to respond to them. And so an important thing we have to look at is that when you're looking at opportunities like this, if you're the one trying to get money, the funder, the person who put out the call, they must always win, right? So the funder has some set of objectives. You have some set of objectives. And your goal is to try, when you're doing opportunity searching, opportunity finding, you want to find ones where your objectives and the funder's objectives are close enough aligned that the funder gets a win, right? They don't have to, your objectives don't have to completely match them, but if there's enough of a match, right? If you can target the alignment of your objectives with some of the funders, and you can work it out so that maybe the way although you have your high level objectives, you can sort of twist your objectives a little bit so that your target objectives for this particular effort, for proposal, for example, line up with your the funder's objectives. That's when you can really start to make progress. And of course, you can have multiple objectives. So that first objective takes you a little bit from where you really wanted to be, but you might be able to find a second opportunity, a third, fourth, and by putting together a sequence or a portfolio of opportunities that each have different alignments with different potential funders, you might be able to get where you want to go when you're going on. So in my companies, for example, I routinely would go after a proposal that was not 100% where I wanted my company to be. Why? Because there was no funder that was going in the direction of where I wanted to be. Going 100% where I wanted to be. They would be slightly aligned, and it would allow me to do things where my objectives would be, well, one, I can pay my employees, we can feed ourselves, but also we would advance our technology, we would advance our skills, we would get in a secondary objective of delivering on a project that would give us the credibility to the agency so that when we go to the next project, we have more credibility. So don't view, I can't find a funder that does what I want as the end. You got to find the ones that are closest to what you want, and then use that as a stepping stone to get where you want to be. So think of it as a sequence of opportunities. So when you're looking for those opportunities, you can go out and say, I'm only going to do it if the opportunity is exactly what I want to achieve. In which case, the space of available opportunities will probably be really close to zero, unless what you want to achieve is something very mundane, in which case it may be fine. The way I've been describing this, and the way I'm describing it here with the idea of a funder, and I call it the funder, but if I was talking about scientific papers, it would be similar in the sense that the reviewer. Somebody is where you're submitting your tactical writing. Whoever's going to analyze that, they have to win. You only win if you can tell your story, if you can tell your objectives aligned in such a way that the story makes the funder, the decision maker, understand that they have won. Very few, in fact, I don't know of any funders whose primary objective is to help you achieve your objectives. Even when they're philanthropic and they're giving away money to do certain things, they're doing it for a cause. They don't randomly give to every cause. They have to see you as a person that's going to help advance their cause, whether it be sustainability issues, dealing with homeless, whatever. There's a lot of things that are well-meaning, well-intentioned groups giving money, but they still only give when the story you tell lines up with what their objectives are. They're not doing it because you're a good person. They might not do it if you're not a good person, if you're not a good organization. That's easy to get rid of things for that reason. But they rarely do something just because an organization is a good organization or a good person. So think about that when you start looking for your opportunities. So there's a couple of very broad places within the U.S. that are useful to look at. So one is called Grants.gov. You can see a little bit on this slide here. These change all the time, so it's not something where you can use this as a fixed item. But in this example, you can go out and you can sort of see, first, you can actually enter some keywords and search for things. They show up over here. So in this particular case, example, I searched for the word innovation. If I actually know particular things, because I've seen an opportunity number or a CDFA, a call for application number, I can look for that. Over here in the search, it's going to show me, I can sort by all kinds of different things. I sort it here by posting date. So these are the most recent things of the day I posted, where they have a range of different topics. But this is the U.S. federal government. They look for lots of things. This is not just scientific research. Meat and Poultry Processing Expansion Program Phase 2. Okay. Don't know exactly what that is, but that's probably not advanced science, the kinds of stuff I would do. USA Disaster Risk Management Activity. That might be something the university could look at. Specialty Crop Multi-State Program. Again, not probably something we're looking at. Oops. So here's one that's looking at outreach, weed management. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. So don't think that the federal government, although you might think of me as somebody who does lots of science projects, right? I've actually done some U.S. aid projects where we did proposals for art. There might be one in here where somebody is trying to figure out, like, how do we acquire art or do something to get art in various places, because the government does some of that. But this is all federal stuff. And you can also limit things to where things go for. There are things where only like cities or towns can go, or for-profits. So you can use this as a good initial filter. One of the things you can do with this is, after you get done, you can actually save searches, you can export them. You can even set this up so it will email you when new things come out, which can be a very useful technique. And of course, this is the one most of you will probably start with, where you can just go to search engine and search for call for proposals. Generally, I would recommend you put in a few other words, like what kind of proposals you want. This is just to show you that if I call for proposals, there's a whole bunch of different things will show up. This is a little bit more cumbersome and tedious. You might have to go through dozens and dozens of pages. You'll get lots of irrelevant stuff. And so when we talk a little bit about research in the next chapter, we'll go into techniques to make this a little bit better. But this gives you an idea. There's a lot of opportunities out there. You have to go in and figure out what those opportunities are going to be and how you're going to relate to them. So if you've gone through all this, now we've detected our objectives and we've identified some opportunities. It's now coming to the last step of the loop, which is to work about preliminary stories. So this is what I recommend is a template for a one-sentence preliminary story. There are 6 required elements of each of these lines. The first is a character. And this is not a character of you. This is not I want or I need. This is something for the funder, something for the reviewer. Who's going to be looking at this? It's a character they care about. It could be a story, homeless people need something, or it could be something in their organization, right? Whatever. You come up with a character, they need something. And there's a reason they need something. That because is actually very, very important. Because the because is going to drive how we tell some of our story and what's going to be our advantages. But something is stopping it from happening, right? So we are going to do something, and finally there's a resolution. These, when we get into storytelling later in the semester, you'll get to see this for sure. But these are 6 of the 8 fundamental elements of what make a good story, and you want to try and fill these in for each of the opportunities in the story you're looking at. So this makes you think about the opportunity, and the first 2 to 3 things are about the opportunity. Somebody needs something because of something, but something's not happening for them. So the last 2 are your objectives. How do we relate those back to us? So we can do this finally, right? You can actually also, when you do this, make sure that the so finally are very related to your objectives. But for most people, relating things to their objectives is not the hard part. The hard part is dealing with the beginning. And you got to remember